Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning and something has changed. Not the room, not the bed, not the face staring back at you from the bathroom mirror. What's changed is far more disturbing. Every memory of your name has vanished. Every recollection of your childhood, your relationships, your triumphs and failures, gone. You can describe the face in the mirror with perfect clarity. The color of the eyes, the shape of the nose, the texture of the skin, but you cannot say who it belongs to. You know you're conscious, you know you're experiencing this moment, but the you that's experiencing it? That familiar sense of being someone specific, someone with a story, someone with an identity? It's nowhere to be found. Frightening? Absolutely. But here's what's even more unsettling. There's something oddly liberating about it, isn't there? Something almost peaceful. Now let me ask you something that might shake you even more than this thought experiment. What if this scenario isn't a nightmare at all? What if it's actually closer to reality than the way you experience yourself right now? Every single day, you wake up and slip effortlessly into the costume of yourself. You check your phone and think, I have 17 notifications. You look at your schedule and say, I don't have time for this. You scroll through social media and curate the image of who you are. Your entire life is built on this assumption, this unquestioned belief that there's a continuous, consistent self at the center of your experience. Your ambitions, your anxieties, your relationships, your deepest fears, they all depend on the existence of this I that you never think to question. But what if you've been living inside the most elaborate illusion ever constructed? What if consciousness is absolutely real, vivid, immediate, undeniable, but the sense of a unified self at its center is nothing more than a story your brain tells itself? A cognitive magic trick so convincing that you've never thought to look behind the curtain. This isn't just philosophical speculation anymore. Ancient Eastern wisdom that spent millennia exploring this question is now colliding with cutting-edge neuroscience, and the results are disturbing. The mystics of the East whispered about it in mountain monasteries. Modern brain scanners are confirming it in sterile laboratories. The algorithms that predict your next click already know it better than you do. The self? That thing you're most certain exists, that thing you'd swear on your life is real, might be the most successful illusion in human history. So I'm going to ask you to do something that might feel terrifying. I'm going to ask you to question the one thing you've never questioned, to examine the one assumption that everything else in your life depends on. Because if the self isn't real, what then are we?
2,500 years ago, while the West was still building empires and worshipping gods carved from stone, something extraordinary was happening in the mountains and forests of ancient India. A prince named Siddhartha sat beneath a tree and came face to face with a truth so radical, so destabilizing, that it would shake the foundations of human understanding forever. He discovered that the self, that thing we cling to most desperately, doesn't exist. Not in the way we think it does. This wasn't some mystical revelation whispered by spirits or delivered by divine intervention. This was the result of the most rigorous introspection ever undertaken. Years of meditation, of turning consciousness back on itself, of examining the very fabric of experience with surgical precision. What he found was shocking. When you look for the self, really look, with the kind of focused attention that cuts through assumptions and wishful thinking, you don't find a thing. You don't find an essence, a soul, a core identity that persists through time. Instead, you find what Buddhism calls the 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These are the building blocks of experience, constantly arising and passing away like waves on an ocean. Your body changes every moment. Your sensations flicker in and out of existence. Your perceptions shift and transform. Your thoughts appear and disappear like clouds in an empty sky. Even your consciousness, that pure awareness you think of as you, is not a thing, but a process. Not a noun, but a verb. But here's the mind-bending part. These aggregates trick us into believing there's someone experiencing them. They create the illusion of a continuous I that moves through time, collecting experiences like souvenirs. The Buddha called this illusion Anatta, no self. And he claimed that recognizing this truth was the key to ending human suffering. Think about that for a moment. Every anxiety you've ever felt, every moment of jealousy, every flash of anger or surge of pride, all of it depends on the belief that there's a you to be threatened, a you to be diminished, a you to be enhanced. But what if there isn't? Now, the Hindu tradition, which emerged from the same spiritual landscape, came to a different conclusion. They spoke of Atman, the true self, an eternal essence that underlies all experience. According to this view, the problem isn't that the self doesn't exist, but that we've forgotten what it really is. Here was the great debate that would echo through centuries. Is the deepest truth about human nature that we are everything, or that we are nothing? That we are an eternal soul, or a temporary collection of processes? But notice something crucial. Whether they believed in Atman or Anatta, both traditions agreed on one thing. The everyday sense of self that we take for granted is an illusion. The I that worries about the future, that replays the past, that constantly narrates experience. That voice in your head that never stops talking is not what you really are. In temple halls and mountain caves, in whispered conversations between teacher and student, these ancient explorers of consciousness were dissecting the most fundamental assumption of human experience. They were performing surgery on the sense of identity itself. And their conclusion was unanimous. The self we think we are is a case of mistaken identity. But if these philosophies declared the everyday self to be an illusion, why did humans continue to live as if it were concrete? Why does the feeling of being a separate, continuous I persist with such stubborn intensity? That question would haunt spiritual seekers for millennia.
While Eastern philosophy was busy deconstructing the self, the West was doing the opposite, building entire civilizations around its existence. Christianity placed the individual soul at the center of cosmic drama. Each person was a unique creation, destined for either salvation or damnation based on their individual choices. The self wasn't just real, it was eternal. Then came René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, with his famous declaration, "I think, therefore I am." In just 4 words, he seemed to solve the problem of existence forever. The very fact that you can doubt proves that there's a you doing the doubting. The self wasn't just assumed, it was logically proven. For centuries, this seemed unshakable. The Western mind built its entire worldview on the foundation of individual consciousness, individual rights, individual responsibility. The self was the starting point of everything. But cracks began to appear. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, performed an experiment that would have made a Buddhist monk smile.
He turned his attention inward, searching for this self that Descartes claimed to have proven. And he found nothing. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. Sound familiar? Hume had independently discovered what Buddhist thinkers had been saying for over 2,000 years. When you look for the self, you don't find a thing. You find a bundle of perceptions in constant flux. But the West wasn't ready for this revelation. Hume's insights were largely ignored, dismissed as philosophical curiosities. The march of Western civilization continued, built on the assumption of solid, separate selves. The self was the starting point of everything. But Charles Darwin dropped a bomb on human exceptionalism. If human beings evolved from other animals, if consciousness itself was the product of natural selection, then maybe the sense of self wasn't divinely implanted. Maybe it was just another evolutionary adaptation, useful for survival, but not necessarily reflecting ultimate truth. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether the self exists or illusory. The question was why evolution would create such a powerful illusion in the first place. What survival advantage could there be in believing you're something you're not? The pieces of a puzzle were beginning to fall into place, a puzzle that would require the insights of psychology and neuroscience to complete. Philosophy had raised the question. Eastern wisdom had suggested an answer. Evolution provided a mechanism. But the real revelation was still to come. The question was no longer whether the self exists. It was why we feel it so strongly if it doesn't. And that question would lead to discoveries that make ancient Buddhist insights look like prophecies from the future.
Here's what happened when neuroscientists finally got their hands on the mystery of the self. They discovered that your brain is a liar. Not intentionally malicious, mind you, but your brain is not the truth-seeking, reality-mapping device you think it is. It's something far more interesting and far more disturbing. It's a storyteller, a novelist, a screenwriter working around the clock to convince you that you're the star of a coherent, continuous narrative. And it's extraordinarily good at its job. Let me show you just how good. In the 1960s, researchers began studying patients who had undergone split brain surgery, a procedure that severs the connection between the brain's two hemispheres. What they discovered shattered everything we thought we knew about the unified self. When these patients were shown an image only to their right hemisphere, the one that can see but can't speak, something fascinating happened. The right hemisphere would process the image and react to it, but the left hemisphere, the one that creates language, had no idea what was happening. So researchers would ask, "Why did you just do that?" And the left hemisphere, having no clue what had actually triggered the behavior, would confidently make up a story. A completely fabricated explanation that felt absolutely true to the patient. The most shocking part? The patients weren't lying. They genuinely believed their made-up explanations. Their brains had automatically generated a story to maintain the illusion of a unified self. This wasn't a malfunction. This was the brain working exactly as designed. Your brain is constantly doing this,
taking the fragmented, chaotic stream of experiences and weaving them into a coherent narrative with you as the protagonist. It's happening right now as you listen to these words. Your brain is creating the story of you listening to a documentary about the illusion of self, complete with explanations for why you're interested, what you're thinking, and what kind of person this makes you. But here's the thing. That story is being edited in real time. Memory research has revealed something that should terrify anyone attached to their personal history. Every time you remember something, you're not accessing a file stored in some neurological archive. You're reconstructing the memory from fragments, and in the process, you're changing it. Your autobiographical story, the narrative that defines who you think you are, is being constantly rewritten, like a movie in perpetual post-production, with scenes being cut, dialogue being dubbed, and plot holes being smoothed over to maintain narrative coherence. The protagonist of your life story is quite literally being improvised moment by moment. This happens primarily through what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the brain's resting state that becomes active when you're not focused on the outside world. This network has been called the narrator of the brain, and it's obsessed with self-referential thinking. It's constantly asking, what does this mean for me? How does this relate to my story? What does this say about who I am? The default mode network evolved for crucial survival functions: planning, predicting threats, maintaining social relationships, learning from past experiences. But in the process of performing these functions, it creates an extraordinary side effect, the convincing illusion of a continuous central self that all experiences happen to. It's like having a novelist living in your head, constantly crafting a story called My Life, with you as the main character. And here's the kicker. You've become so absorbed in the story that you've forgotten its fiction. The evolutionary purpose is clear. A brain that can create a coherent sense of self can better navigate social hierarchies, plan for the future, and learn from past mistakes. The self is a user interface, a simplified representation that allows the incredibly complex system of your brain to coordinate its activities and interact with other selves. But just like the icons on your computer desktop aren't actually folders, the self isn't actually you. It's a representation. A very convincing one. And this representation has become so seamless, so automatic, that we've mistaken the interface for the reality. We've fallen in love with the story and forgotten it's just a story. But why is this illusion so unshakable? Why do we cling to it even when presented with overwhelming evidence that it's false? The answer lies in the deepest layers of human psychology, where the fear of non-existence meets the evolutionary imperative to survive.
Even if you accept everything I've told you so far, even if you intellectually understand that the self is a construction, a story, an illusion, there's something inside you that rebels against this knowledge. You might think, okay, maybe the self is more fluid than I thought. Maybe it's constructed by my brain. But surely there's still a me having this realization. Surely there's still someone home. This resistance isn't stupidity. It's not denial. It's one of the most profound survival mechanisms ever evolved. Because what happens when the story of self begins to dissolve? What happens when that central character starts to feel unreal? Terror. Not the kind of fear you feel when facing a physical threat. Something deeper, more primal. The kind of existential panic that touches the very core of what it means to be human. Psychologists call this ego death or depersonalization, and it's one of the most disturbing experiences a human being can have. Suddenly, the familiar sense of being someone specific, someone with boundaries and continuity, begins to evaporate. The world continues to exist, consciousness continues to flow, but the I that usually claims ownership of that consciousness starts to fade. And your brain will do anything to prevent this from happening. This is where terror management theory comes in. Humans are perhaps the only animals cursed with the knowledge of their own mortality. We know we're going to die, and this knowledge creates a constant underlying anxiety that shapes everything we do. The sense of self serves as a psychological fortress against this terror. As long as I exist, as long as there's a continuous me that persists through time, death feels like something that happens to other people in some distant future, to some future version of myself that I can't quite imagine. But if the self is revealed to be an illusion, if there's no continuous me to begin with, then what exactly is there to lose? And paradoxically, if there's nothing to lose, then everything I think I am is already gone. This is why spiritual traditions that teach the dissolution of self often report that students go through what mystics call the dark night of the soul, a period of profound disorientation and terror as the familiar landmarks of identity begin to crumble. But the resistance to letting go of self isn't just about death anxiety. It's woven into the very fabric of how we think. Cognitive biases that seem unrelated to the self actually serve to reinforce it. The egocentric bias makes us interpret everything through the lens of, what does this mean for me? The confirmation bias helps us maintain a consistent self-image by filtering out information that contradicts our personal narrative. We even have something called the endowment effect, the tendency to overvalue things simply because we own them. But this doesn't just apply to objects. We overvalue identities, beliefs, and personality traits simply because we think they belong to us. They become part of the story of who we are, and threatening that story feels like threatening our very existence. And then there's the social dimension. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures. Our sense of self isn't just personal, it's interpersonal. We exist in relation to others, and those relationships depend on having a relatively stable identity that others can recognize and relate to. If I'm constantly changing, if my sense of self is too fluid, how can others know who they're dealing with? How can I maintain the social bonds that are crucial for survival and well-being? So the brain creates what we might call a steady state illusion, a sense of being the same person over time, even as everything about us is actually in constant flux. Our cells replace themselves every few years. Our thoughts and feelings change moment by moment. Our personalities shift subtly throughout our lives. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. The illusion of self is demonstrably false, but it's also psychologically indispensable. We need it to function, to relate to others, to plan for the future, to maintain sanity in the face of constant change and eventual death. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. If the illusion of self is so powerful, so necessary, and so vulnerable, what happens when it becomes weaponized? What happens when the technologies that shape our daily lives begin to exploit this fundamental vulnerability in human psychology? While philosophers debate and neuroscientists probe, something else has been studying human nature with unprecedented precision and unprecedented success: algorithms. And they've come to the same conclusion that Buddhist monks reached 2,500 years ago. The unified self is an illusion. But unlike the monks, the algorithms aren't trying to liberate us from this illusion, they're trying to profit from it. Right now, as you watch this video, dozens of algorithmic systems are tracking your behavior, learning your patterns, predicting your preferences. And here's what's fascinating and terrifying. They don't model you as a unified self making rational decisions. They model you exactly as the Buddha described, as a collection of aggregates, a bundle of tendencies, a pattern of responses with no central controller. Facebook doesn't care who you think you are. It cares about the statistical likelihood that you'll click on certain types of content based on your past behavior. Netflix doesn't recommend movies to your true self. It recommends them to the cluster of preferences that emerge from your viewing history. Spotify creates playlists not for the person you believe yourself to be, but for the mood states and activity patterns that your listening data reveals. Amazon suggests purchases not based on your conscious desires, but on the behavioral patterns shared by users with similar digital fingerprints. And here's the shocking part. These algorithmic models predict your behavior more accurately than you can predict it yourself. They know you'll buy something before you consciously decide to buy it. They know you're becoming depressed before you realize you're becoming depressed. They can predict with startling accuracy whether you're likely to default on a loan, quit your job, or end a relationship. How is this possible? Because they're not fooled by the story of self that keeps you trapped. They see through the illusion to the underlying patterns, the actual aggregates that drive behavior. While you're busy maintaining the narrative of being a rational, consistent individual making conscious choices, the algorithms are tracking the real you, a collection of impulses, habits, emotional reactions, and behavioral patterns that follow predictable rules. This creates an unprecedented asymmetry of power. The companies deploying these algorithms understand human nature at a level deeper than most humans understand themselves. They've discovered that the self is not the captain of the ship. It's more like a passenger who's been convinced they're driving, while the real navigation happens below the level of conscious awareness. And they're using this knowledge to influence behavior in ways that feel organic and self-directed, but are actually carefully orchestrated. When you scroll through social media and feel compelled to keep scrolling, that's not your autonomous self making a free choice. That's an algorithm that has learned to trigger the behavioral patterns that generate engagement, regardless of whether that engagement serves your conscious goals or values. When you buy something online after seeing a targeted ad, the purchase feels like your decision, your preference, your expression of identity. But it's actually the result of algorithmic manipulation that bypassed your sense of self entirely and spoke directly to the underlying patterns that drive behavior. The most sophisticated forms of digital manipulation don't try to convince your rational mind of anything. They don't make arguments or present evidence. Instead, they create environmental conditions that make certain behaviors feel natural and inevitable. It's like being influenced by weather patterns. You don't argue with rain, you just find yourself reaching for an umbrella. This is the dark miracle of algorithmic capitalism. It has discovered that the most effective way to influence human behavior is to ignore the human entirely and focus on the patterns that exist beneath conscious awareness. The algorithms know something that most people find too threatening to accept. You are not the author of your own story.
You're more like a character in a story being written by forces you don't understand, using information about yourself that you don't have access to. But the implications go far beyond commerce and convenience. This dissolution of the self isn't just happening in our purchasing decisions and entertainment choices. It's happening in our politics, our relationships, our most fundamental sense of who we are and what we believe.
If the self is an illusion, albeit a necessary one, then what happens when that illusion begins to crack under pressure? Look around. We're living through an epidemic of identity crisis, and it's playing out on every level of society. In politics, we're witnessing a tribalism so intense that people seem willing to abandon previously held beliefs, relationships, even basic facts in order to maintain identification with their chosen group. Why? Because when the self is fragile and constructed, ideology becomes existential. To challenge someone's political beliefs isn't just to disagree with their ideas, it's to threaten the very story they tell themselves about who they are. This explains the fury, the irrationality, the seemingly impossible polarization of public discourse. We're not really arguing about policies or facts. We're defending our carefully constructed sense of self against what feels like annihilation. When your identity depends on being a conservative or a liberal, a believer or a skeptic, a patriot or a rebel, any information that threatens that identity triggers the same psychological alarm system that would activate if you were facing physical death. Because, in a very real sense, you are. The person you think you are, the one whose political views make perfect sense and whose moral positions are obviously correct, that person would cease to exist if you genuinely opened yourself to opposing viewpoints. And your brain will do anything to prevent that psychological death, even if it means distorting reality, dismissing evidence, or demonizing people who threaten your worldview. But it's not just politics. This identity fragility is showing up in our mental health in unprecedented ways. Anxiety and depression rates are skyrocketing, particularly among young people who've grown up in the digital age. And while there are many factors contributing to this crisis, one often overlooked element is the increasing difficulty of maintaining a coherent sense of self in a world that's constantly challenging our self-narratives. Social media presents us with endless opportunities for comparison, endless ways to feel inadequate, endless evidence that the story we tell ourselves about who we are might not be accurate. The carefully curated versions of other people's lives make our own inner experience feel messy and insufficient by comparison. But more fundamentally, the digital age has accelerated the dissolution of traditional sources of identity, stable communities, predictable career paths, shared cultural narratives. The external structures that used to help maintain the illusion of a solid, continuous self are disappearing. And when those external supports crumble, we're left face to face with the fundamental instability of identity itself. This shows up clinically in conditions like depersonalization disorder, where people report feeling unreal or like they're watching their life from outside their body. But these aren't necessarily pathological experiences. They might be glimpses of the truth that the sense of self is more fragile than we usually allow ourselves to recognize. Even common anxiety often involves moments when the familiar boundaries of identity begin to feel uncertain. Who am I really? What if I'm not the person I think I am? What if my entire life is based on false assumptions about myself? These questions terrify us precisely because they point towards something true. Interestingly, the same digital technologies that contribute to identity crisis are also offering solutions that mirror ancient wisdom. Meditation apps are mainstream now. Mindfulness practices are being prescribed by doctors. Therapy approaches that focus on accepting the fluid nature of thoughts and feelings rather than trying to control them are becoming standard treatment. The irony is remarkable. The technologies that reveal the illusory nature of self are driving people toward practices that have always been about recognizing the illusory nature of self. But these practices aren't about destroying identity. They're about developing a healthier relationship with it. They teach us to hold our sense of self more lightly, to recognize it as a useful fiction rather than an absolute reality. This is the paradox we're living through. The ancient question that once seemed like abstract philosophy has become the defining psychological challenge of our time. How do we live authentically when authenticity itself might be an illusion? How do we make meaningful choices when the chooser might be a fiction? How do we love and be loved when the boundaries between self and other are more porous than we imagined? These aren't just personal questions anymore. They're civilizational questions. Because the answer will determine not just individual well-being, but the future of human society. So what do we do when we realize that both Eastern mystics and modern neuroscientists converge on the same unsettling verdict that the self is not real?
We've taken this journey together, from ancient wisdom to modern neuroscience, from philosophical speculation to algorithmic manipulation. We've seen the evidence from every angle, every discipline, every approach to understanding human consciousness. The verdict is remarkably consistent. The self, as we commonly experience it, is an illusion. A necessary illusion, a useful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. So now what? This is where most explorations of this topic falter. They present the evidence, drop the philosophical bomb, and then leave you sitting in the rubble of your former worldview, wondering what to do next. But here's the thing about recognizing illusions. The recognition itself doesn't make them disappear. Even after you understand how a magic trick works, you can still enjoy the show. The self is like that. Even when you see through it, it continues to function. It has to. You still need to navigate the world, make decisions, form relationships, pursue goals. The question isn't whether to eliminate the sense of self. That's neither possible nor desirable. The question is how to relate to it skillfully. Eastern philosophy has been working on this problem for millennia, and their insights are surprisingly practical. The goal isn't the complete dissolution of identity. That's a misunderstanding that has led many Western seekers astray. The goal is what Buddhists call right view, seeing clearly what the self is and what it isn't. When you recognize that your sense of self is constructed, something miraculous happens. You become free to participate in that construction consciously. Instead of being a victim of your own psychological processes, you become a collaborator with them. You can still have preferences, but you're not imprisoned by them. You can still have a personality, but you're not limited by it. You can still have goals and dreams, but you're not destroyed when they don't unfold as expected. This isn't spiritual bypassing or philosophical detachment. It's actually the opposite. It's full engagement with life from a place of psychological freedom rather than psychological compulsion. Modern psychology has been discovering similar principles through what are called acceptance-based therapies.
These approaches don't try to eliminate difficult thoughts and feelings. They help people develop a different relationship with them. Instead of, "I am depressed," you learn to observe, depression is arising. Instead of, "I am angry," you notice, anger is present. Instead of, "I am a failure," you recognize thoughts about failure are occurring. This isn't semantic game playing. It's a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own experience. It creates space between the awareness that observes and the experiences being observed. And in that space, freedom becomes possible. But let's be honest about what this freedom looks like. It's not the freedom to become someone else entirely. It's the freedom to stop being trapped by who you think you are. It's the freedom to be curious about your own reactions instead of being controlled by them. The freedom to hold your beliefs lightly enough that you can examine them. The freedom to love without the desperate clinging that comes from believing you might lose yourself in the process. Most paradoxically, it's the freedom to be more human, not less. When you stop investing so much energy in defending and maintaining a fixed sense of self, that energy becomes available for other things: creativity, compassion, genuine connection with others, engagement with life as it actually is, rather than as you think it should be. This isn't becoming passive or nihilistic. Some of the most dynamic, creative, effective people throughout history have been those who held their sense of self lightly. Artists who could access parts of themselves they didn't know existed. Leaders who could adapt to circumstances without losing their core principles. Innovators who could think beyond the boundaries of conventional identity. The dissolution of the rigid self isn't a loss, it's a liberation. But here's the final twist in our story. The most profound realization isn't that the self doesn't exist. It's that the recognition of this truth is itself a deeply human experience. Only a conscious being could question the nature of consciousness. Only a self-aware creature could discover the illusory nature of self-awareness. Only humans could look in the mirror and question whether anyone is looking back. In some cosmic sense, the universe has evolved to the point where it can question its own existence through us. The illusion of self isn't a mistake or a design flaw. It's the very mechanism through which reality becomes conscious of itself. You are not separate from the universe having an experience of being human. You are the universe experiencing itself as if it were separate, as if it were human. And that illusion, magnificent, terrible, beautiful, absurd, is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened in the known cosmos. So here's my final question for you, the one that will linger long after this video ends. If the self is an illusion, but you are the very awareness in which that illusion appears, if you are not who you think you are, but something far more vast and mysterious, what kind of life will you live once you let go of the small story and embrace the infinite mystery of what you actually are? The answer to that question isn't philosophical. It's the rest of your life.